Welcome to the fifth and final lecture in this series on Salvador Dali and the Resurgence of Surrealism. So in 1934, Dali and Gala traveled to New York for the first time, where he was planning to exhibit work in the art gallery of Julian Levy, for which he was actually transporting the paintings on the ship. Art historian Dikran Tashjian has commented, prior to this, Dali's fame in the U.S. was mainly known within the art world, but his arrival would begin a series of events where he began to lay the groundwork for himself and his work as the exemplar of Surrealism in the United States. In this final lecture, I want to explore Surrealism's international reach during the mid to late 1930s, particularly through exhibitions and installations, and how Dali began to tailor this to his own advantage to become, in the United States at least, the poster child of the movement itself. And this is just a nice photo of Dali and Man Ray in Paris in 1934. So it was for his exhibition at Julian Levy's gallery that Dali prepared a broadsheet titled "New York Salutes Me," where he wrote an intriguing explanation of the role of Surrealism. Quote, "There are existing already in the world a number of incommensurable living madmen who profess to revive the same prerogatives for dream and delirium, the same fetishist credit as accorded reality, who extended each moment the most demoralizing discredit to the rational, logical, practical world, who exchange the substance and shadow of objects, the substance and shadow of love, who affront aesthetes and highbrows with the perverse mechanism of erotic imagination, and who emerge at sundown to watch with infinite cannibal nostalgia the distant and sparkling sewing machines cut in blocks of ruby. Such are the Surrealists." End quote. It's a lovely sentiment, but as Tashjian has pointed out, much of what is contained in this document is drawn from prior sources. The inclusion of Breton's encyclopedia entry on Surrealism right here at the start. From the first manifesto, there is, of course, that nod to Lautremont's sewing machine in that passage. Even his mentioning later on, again, Millet's Angelus. It's almost like a greatest hits of Dali's interests at the time. He's constantly referencing these sorts of aspects. What is perhaps a more direct attempt, though, partly here he's attempting to define for an American audience what Surrealism is. But I think there is also certainly a kind of direct attempt to shock Dali's forceful defining of Surrealists as madmen, quote unquote, and multiple references down here to Sacher Masoch, the kind of infamous writer of the term or of the novel Venus in Furs, and for whom the term masochism was coined. So these aspects of New York Salutes Me suggest not just Dali's attempt to define in an orthodox way what Surrealism is, again for the American public, but it began to define himself as Surrealism itself, as much about spectacle and showmanship as about Surrealism as a set of principles. These dual approaches, of him, I think honestly, truly trying to present what Surrealism is one approach. The other approach is him increasingly recognizing that because there is often a lack of other Surrealists coming to the United States and trying earnestly to promote the movement, he's becoming the face of it. He's becoming acquainted with it, or not acquainted, sorry. He's becoming the poster child of it. These two approaches are evident when we review the main series of events that Dali participated in during this trip. In addition to the exhibition at Levy's Gallery, Dali also gave a lecture at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut, where, according to Marianne Cause, and this was asked as a question last time, he apparently first gave his famous pronouncement that, quote, "the only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad." I think we tend to think of that as a later quote, but this is fairly early. This is 1934. Linking the statement here with the description of the Surrealists as living madmen in New York Salutes Me does suggest a clearer way Dalí is attempting to define the movement for an American audience. He also gave a lecture titled Surrealist Paintings and Paranoiac Images at the Museum of Modern Art in January 1935. And as a final salvo, his presence led Caress Crosby, who had kind of initiated him making this trek to America, and Joelle Levy, Julian Levy's wife, to organize the now infamous Bal Honorique, a surrealist-themed costume party held in Manhattan. You can read excerpts of it, and I think it's rather fascinating. Something I discovered was Dalí's costume. He came referencing a bra, a brassiere. And the reason why is because I had never heard this before. Caress Crosby invented the brassiere. And so he was making a kind of direct corollary with her, partly as patron, partly as a friend and associate. But a slight scandal ensued due to Gala's costume. According to Marianne Cause, she wore a, quote, red cellophane skirt over a mini skirt, and atop her head, a baby doll with a lobster around its temples, end quote. Seems benign enough. And I do just want to point out, this painting over here from around 1934 references the design Dalí made for the invitation for this ball. And it's pretty clear that they had this idea of a baby around the head in some aspect of this. But the reason that her costume became scandalous was because attendees saw the baby doll as a veiled reference to the relatively recent kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. This was back in the news. This had occurred back in 1932, but it was back in the news due to the recent arrest of Bruno Hauptmann in September 1934. So it was kind of yet again fresh on people's minds. It is this penchant to, and here we just have a photo, or a news headline about the Lindbergh baby's tragic body being discovered. It's this penchant to effectively blur the line between surrealist principles and activities with public promotion that increasingly led to Dalí becoming the face of surrealism in the United States. Oops, wrong way. This expansion of surrealism to the U.S. was part of a broader strategy in the 1930s by the Surrealist group to inaugurate and support surrealist activity and groups popping up internationally. By the 1930s, groups had emerged in Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Sweden, Yugoslavia, Greece, Peru, Japan, Romania, the Canary Islands, and soon to be joined by a group in England and a contingent group in Mexico. Evidence of this internationalization of surrealism was promoted by a series of exhibitions during the late 1930s, presenting work by an increasingly international contingent of surrealists. One of the first of these was the International Surrealist Exhibition in London, which was designed by Breton and Paul Éluard in Paris with a nascent British surrealist group, and meant as a showcase of both surrealist practices, a showcase of this newly formed British surrealist group, and also indicating the movement's arrival in England as well. Here on the left is a photograph of Breton speaking at the opening. This is most likely a photo from the second lecture that he gave. The first was called Limits, Not Frontiers of Surrealism, which I think is a wonderfully, strangely anachronistic and ironic title. But he presented to a packed crowd of 2,000 people who came out to hear him talk. And this lecture we see on the left is most likely him presenting on the surrealist object. And I think that's important because it shows, as we talked about last time, the increasing dominance of surrealist objects within the movement and as part of their activity and as part of their visual artistic endeavors. Dalí, too, gave a lecture at the exhibition titled, quote, Authentic Paranoiac Fantasies. This presentation has become legendary. Here on the right, we see a group of surrealists. Here's Paul Éluard, his new wife, Noosh. Here is E.L.T. Messens. Rupert Lee is right here, and then Diana Breton Lee is over here. Then there is a strange man in a diving suit. That strange man in the diving suit is Salvador Dali. Dali's lecture, Authentic Paranoiac Fantasies, I think further indicates how he continued to inculcate his own practices around the paranoiac critical method. He's very focused on paranoia as his purview of surrealist ideology. But he also intentionally designed his lecture to defy logic. He showed slides out of order, upside down. No matter what was on the slide, he identified it as Greta Garbo, which you have no idea how much I wanted to do that today. Moreover, Dali chose to present his lecture while wearing a diving suit, ostensibly, as Marianne Cause suggests, a visual connotation of diving into the depths of the unconscious, which seems a little much, but he unfortunately chose to do this on a very hot day, and when he got out on stage, he realized that it was so hot he could not breathe well, and he started, according to his own claims, to asphyxiate. And unfortunately, the more he gesticulated, trying to get people to take the helmet off, the more they thought it was all part of the act. It was only finally when Roland Penrose, surrealist and British art collector, realized something was really wrong, that they went and got a wrench and a pool cue and just kind of tore the helmet off of him so he wouldn't die. So I think I think by this point what we clearly start seeing is that Dali, he's always been a showman. But this is now a very kind of public showmanship-esque way that he is trying to present himself as a surrealist. Now, amidst all this activity, further evidence of surrealism's reach beyond the orthodox group was a massive exhibition organized by Alfred H. Barr at the Museum of Modern Art in New York titled Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism. Opening at the end of 1936, the exhibition set out to link early historical fantastic art featuring works by Leonardo, Bosch, and Goya to the current trends in modern art broadly and Dada and Surrealism specifically. On one hand, the expansive historical approach worked to legitimize Dada and Surrealism, which by this point were still very new, and Surrealism at least still a very active movement. So it's legitimizing these movements. But on the other hand, because Barr did not invite Breton, to lecture at the exhibition, the Surrealists attempted to intervene and problematize the exhibition itself. Barr later described his work on this show as the, quote, most appalling task ever. Dali, though, featured prominently in the exhibition with 14 works of art, a few of which we have seen before. Illumined Pleasures, Paranoiac Face, which is a painting based on the postcard of the African village we talked about last time, and I find it interesting that in this case they paired it with a painting by Picasso to further reinforce that idea of that's what Dali saw. The infamous persistence of memory was exhibited here, and in fact this is what led Barr to buy it for the Museum of Modern Art, where you can see it today. And the painting featured in the exhibition upstairs, this painting, The Ghost of Vermeer, of Delft, which can be used as a table from 1934, recently painted at this point. I mean, it's only about 2 years old. But it was in the show as well. So just as you look at it upstairs, I think, this helps put into context how it is being exhibited at this time as well. Nearly all of Dali's works in the MoMA show, and most of the works generally, were two-dimensional. There are objects, there are sculptures, but there's a preponderance of two-dimensional works, paintings, drawings, prints, collages. However, according to the master checklist from MoMA, this 1933 surrealist object on the left by Dalí was shown. Notably, though, it was only shown as a photograph by Man Ray of the object. This intriguing assemblage reflects the early, heady days of the advent of the surrealist object. It dates from 1933. Here we have this woman's bust, kind of corn hanging around her neck. Here, almost as a collar, is a strip from a zoetrope. She has ants all over her face, which gives me nightmares. Here is a long loaf of French bread, this baguette. Here, yet again, is another reference to Millet's Angelus. I mean, by this point, it's everywhere, right? You can't not see it. What I find interesting about this object is, on one hand, as an exemplar of surrealism, you can only imagine what people going to MoMA at the time would have thought about this strange concoction of juxtaposed objects kind of all brought together. But from our vantage point here at Lecture 5 of 5, this is like, again, a greatest hits of Dalí's tropes, imagery, symbolism, obsessions, right? Ants, Millet, and then my favorite is this long loaf of bread on the head. It shows up in the second film that Dalí and Buñuel make, The Golden Age. It's just a quick shot of a man walking through the forest with a long baguette on his head. When Dalí arrived in America the first time, he had the crazy idea to walk off the ship with an overly long baguette, and so he had the ship's bakers bake him a long loaf of bread that he carried off, and much to his chagrin, none of the American journalists made any note of the fact that here is this artist from Europe carrying this long thing of bread. So he doesn't make this to showcase what people already know about him, but I think it's telling that this object is beginning to reflect the types of kind of obsessive imagery he works with again and again and again, that audiences, be they European, be they American, are going to begin to recognize as uniquely Dalí. Now, although Breton did not make it out for the MoMA show, Dalí did arrive in New York for it and wrote back to Breton on the impact of the exhibition, which I think is really telling. He wrote Breton, quote, "If you saw it here and the repercussions it has had, you would be very pleased. The influence of surrealism is enormous. They're decorating the windows of the most luxurious stores with surrealism. The creators of animated cartoons are proud to call themselves surrealists. I'm doing my best for our activity," end quote. Clearly, Dalí is trying to make Breton proud of his efforts at spreading surrealism across the ocean. But the surrealist leader, by most accounts, was horrified by his description of surrealism's impact as basically a fad, a momentary fashion among Americans, something that is fully immersed in popular culture rather than kind of bridging that gap that surrealism tries to toe that line very carefully. This situation, I think, was made worse by the press, fully crediting Dalí with America's obsession with surrealism. A Time magazine article on Dalí stated, quote, "Surrealism would never have attracted its present attention in the U.S. were it not for the handsome 32-year-old Catalan," end quote. This 1936-1937 visit to the U.S. by Dalí and Gala was the period where Dalí was making a more concerted effort to present himself to the public as the surrealist, as well as guarantee he used and grew his fame by meeting and working with other popular American figures. It's during this period, for instance, when Dalí met with Harpo Marx, one of my favorite photos ever. Dalí was a huge fan of the Marx Brothers films. If you are a fan of the Marx Brothers, if you think about the way that they are not just hilarious, but very anarchistic, and their entire humor is built around kind of poking at social conventions and mores. You can see why Surrealists, particularly Dali, would like them. In fact, spinning off of this meeting with Harpo Marx, Dali wrote a brief scenario for a Marx Brothers film that he wanted them to star in. It was never made, but thankfully the scenario has been uncovered, and it will be released as a graphic novel in March 2019, and I have already pre-ordered it. By most accounts, and although never formally expelled, by 1935 onward, Dali's direct involvement with the orthodox Surrealist group was cooling, especially after his near expulsion in 1934 with the trial that we talked about last time. Yet he still featured prominently in ongoing Surrealist exhibitions, including perhaps the most important, the 1938 exposition Internationale du Surrealism, held in Paris at the prestigious Galerie Beaux Arts. There's some intriguing kind of behind-the-scenes dealings here. Some recent letters by Paul Éluard to his, by this point now, former spouse, Gala, had come out, and it was basically Gala writing him because he so closely had Breton's ear, begging him to make sure that Dali was not expelled from the movement, just like to keep involving him. And it was probably during this brief period of reconciliation that occurred right when this massive exhibition in Paris, organized by Éluard and Breton at this wildly prestigious gallery, is being organized. And it's, I think, important for us to understand where Surrealism is at here at the end of the 1930s to see what Dali is going to do with it and take from it. This exhibition was monumental. The intent was to further showcase the international expansion of Surrealism, hence the name of the show. And in many ways, also showcase the increasing focus of Surrealist objects within the movement itself. There was a number of things that they did. Breton and Éluard really controlled what the Orthodox group was going to show, but they really left it up to kind of the key figures of the other international groups to choose representatives from them to ship in for this show, which I think shows to some degree kind of Breton always had this very strange, he never wanted to, he always professed he didn't want to be the leader. He wanted people to kind of take it on themselves, but then he would step in and always, he was a micromanager without realizing it, basically. And I think this is a good example of that. He's micromanaging how the Paris group will be shown, but he's letting the other international groups that kind of represent themselves here. I think the intent of this exhibition is further reinforced by the choice Éluard and Breton made of who was going to design this show. They brought in Marcel Duchamp to design this show, and Duchamp really just ran with a lot of these key ideas that they wanted to present. Notably, he wanted to transform this exhibition into a fully immersive experience. And what you're going to see, we're just going to look at a few photographs, but if you look into the entire show, and there's a very great book by the scholar Louis Kacher about this period of exhibitions that I've drawn from to talk about this and to talk about Dali's World's Fair Pavilion. What you'll see is the way that Duchamp very carefully designed and laid out this exhibition so that it was a fully immersive experience. And it was an experience that plays against this concept of interior and exterior. So for instance, when you walked into the gallery, the first hallway was meant to represent a street. You can see there's street signs up here. They had gotten mannequins to line up along the street, which itself is sort of a play off street walkers. And then each artist was given a mannequin to design. Here we have mannequins designed by Sonia Massi, Marcel Duchamp, and André Masson. As you walk into the gallery, you're thinking, I'm going in, but in fact, everything about its design is meant to represent out. interior, exterior, and in a certain way that itself is a kind of play off of Breton's idea of surreality, right? This kind of blending of interior and exterior realities. This was further heightened by the fact that after you went down this hallway, when you went into the main gallery, it was designed to look like a grotto. It had dead leaves on the ground and sand. Duchamp had covered all of the lights above with coal sacks to make it look very dark and shadowy, like you were standing under a thick canopy of trees. And his original idea was they actually, the next room was entirely dark, and to look at anything, they just handed you flashlights, and you turn on the flashlight, turn on the flashlight to walk around. That worked fine until about 2 hours in when nobody was returning the flashlights. And so they're like, well, this won't work. We're going to run out of money just buying flashlights. So they added some soft ambient lighting. But I think what's fascinating is that pride of place was given to this piece by Salvador Dali. This is right at the entrance to the entire exhibition. It's a piece he made for it called Rainy Day Taxi. And here again, we have Dali extending this idea of conflating interior and exterior spaces. This is a real taxi that he is covered in all this kind of viney foliage here. And when you look inside, there is a passenger and a driver. The passenger is also covered in kind of lichen and vines and foliage here and live snails. And they are kept alive by the fact that the Rainy Day Taxi is so named because he ran hoses up through the ceiling and it constantly rained on the inside of the taxi. So again, this inversion of, where do we experience rain? We get in the taxi to get out of the rain. Well, in this case, it's reversed. It's inverted. I think another interesting inversion, and I think something speaking to the idea of the pure idea of a surrealist object is, it's hard to see, but in the seat beside her is a sewing machine. And yet again, another callback to Lautremont's passage of the chance encounter of an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table. And some people have seen that sewing machine as a kind of Dalinian in-joke, right? Of, well, if I'd gone with the other object, an umbrella, that is functional here. So let's not put the umbrella there, let's put the sewing machine there, which is unfunctional, non-functional in this space. Now, according to Louis Kacher, Dali's taxi, created for the 1938 Paris exhibition, was one of his last within the orthodox surrealist group, although that exhibition itself had a wave-like ongoing effect. Edited and smaller versions of it traveled after it closed in Paris to Brussels and Amsterdam. And Dali's dealer in New York, Julien Levy, heard about the exhibition and actually proposed a version of it for a pavilion at the upcoming 1939 World's Fair. There are actually diagrams and plans that he had produced of what he was going to call the Surrealist House. And it was basically taking the same idea and modifying it now for the New York World's Fair in '39. That ultimately fell through. But what comes out of it is that Dali has a hugely successful exhibition at Levy's gallery in 1939. And even Levy himself claimed that the sale of his works was bolstered by this notorious incident indicated here in this news article, again from March 1939. The context of this is that Dali had been hired by the very, very kind of upscale department store Bonwit Teller to design one of their shop windows. And he said, I will do it if you give me complete artistic freedom. And like most dealings with Dali, they said, yes, of course, why wouldn't we? And then he and Gala spent an entire evening just setting up this shop window, left exhausted. I think he claims at like 2 or 3 in the morning. And he came back the next day to see his work, and there's a big crowd around the window, and he's very happy about this. And he walks up and come to find out they had changed his installation. And Dali, of course, being Dali, throws a fit and storms into the store to complain to the manager, and they can't find anyone. So he just goes and he breaks his way into the window through the doorway so he can basically take apart, the pieces that they added or modified. It's like he's claiming it's no longer my work. And he'd had this big bathtub filled with water in there. And so he's like, well, I'm going to dump this water out. So he starts lifting up the bathtub, and it proves to be too much. And basically it just slides and just crashes through the window, dumping it and glass and water out onto the street below. So you have this headline, Bathtub Bests Dali. This was in all the newspapers. It was a huge event. He was fined for, breaking, the shop window and things like that. But Levy claimed that this was the best that could have happened for the sale of his work, because he said, we sold more work at the gallery after this incident. And I think that's a little telling about the way that Dali is starting to understand. I mean, I'm not claiming he did this on purpose. This was entirely accidental, as he was just he was upset that they had changed his installation. But there does begin to come a point where it becomes clear that these kind of antics are a boon to a certain degree. And this is the early kind of gestation of that. It is after this, in fact, that Levy, who had been working on trying to get to this surrealist exhibition as a pavilion at the World's Fair, abandons that, but comes to Dali and says, would you consider doing a pavilion there? And Dali agrees. And what we're going to see come out of that is this very famous Dream of Venus pavilion. But I think another way Dali recognizes, partly I think is a callback to the exhibition that they originally wanted, but I think also as him increasingly understanding that there is power in him reusing images and motifs, he recreates Rainy Day Taxi in New York in 1939. Here it is recreated here. It is not identical or the same, partly because the taxi is different, but also the fact that it is also now called the Columbus taxi, because the driver in the front wears a sign that identifies him as Christopher Columbus with a sign saying, I return. And so there is this sense of modifying the piece to fit this kind of American context. In his autobiography, The Secret Life, Dali presents the experience designing and working on the New York World's Fair Pavilion, Dream of Venus, as an utter disaster. But how it formulates is a Dali World Fair Corporation had been formed by Julian Levy, art collector Edward James, lawyer Philip Wittenberg, and the W.M. Gardner Display Company to fund the making of this pavilion. They hire and sign Dali on as the designer of it. He gets a payment, a certain royalty of sales to the pavilion. And Dali yet again claimed, I will do this if you give me complete artistic control. This is going to be a constant problem. And his notes and designs, I think, what frustrated him, even from the start, were kind of constantly modified. Here on the left is one of the early sketches that he produced of what he wanted the exterior of the pavilion to look like. And it's a really interesting design in the sense that some aspects remain. Here we have Botticelli's Venus show up. Here we have this reference to Leonardo, right, that shows up. Although here he kind of changes the face to be the Mona Lisa instead of St. John. But notice how huge his name was intended to be in the original pavilion, and that has gone away over here. It's not really here at all, much whatsoever. But there is, I think, this really interesting and I think very deliberate erotic nature to this. I mean, notably, if you note the way that the entryway is a pair of female legs coming out here, so it's like we're walking into her lap to go into the space. And this was somewhat tempered by the inclusion of this sort of fish head here, which served as a ticket booth, which was not in the original design. And I love this parent with a child like walking, let's go to the pavilion, right here in his sketch. But two things about this kind of erotic aspect to it. I think today it often seems a little shocking to us that, you know, his intent was to have basically topless and nude models, and they were in the pavilion. But Kacher in his book talks about this in sort of two ways. One way is Dalí's pavilion kind of, again, skirts that line between art and popular culture, kind of boardwalk culture, kind of peep show culture. It kind of walks this line. The other aspect is there was a kind of known aspect of the 1939 World Fair that there were areas just for adults. There were areas that were peep shows. And so this kind of tied into that aspect as well. That aside, what is really, what I find fascinating about the Dream of Venus pavilion is the way that he's thinking about it is really driven by the corporation and the partnerships involved. The reason that W.M. Gardner Corporation was brought on board is because they had basically approached them saying, we've invented a new type of rubber that you can submerge in water and it won't rot or fall apart. It's perfect for this any sort of use of underwater activity. And then you also have the overarching theme of the fair was kind of sea-based and aquatic-based. So this is generating this kind of, you know, aquatic-themed Dream of Venus pavilion itself. And so we have such remarkable things as, here on the left, this is actually from Town and Country, but it is a sketch by Dalí of how he envisioned using this rubber. And so he wanted a doorway in the underwater tank. There were two main areas of the pavilion, a wet area and a dry area. And the wet area was entirely underwater. And he wanted the doorway to be made with a rubber zipper that the mermaids unzipped to swim into, which on one hand is just, I think, a fascinating visual image. If you can imagine like watching underwater performers and they're kind of unzipping this kind of like rubber doorway and flying, swimming through. But I think as well, it very much has a connotation of unzipping and exposing and inviting that, you know, again, is very erotic in nature. But then over here on the right, we have one from a series of photographs that Levy arranged with the photographer George Platt Lenz, who was hired to almost take sort of PR photos. Once the corporation had formed and Dalí was part of it, they wanted to use Dalí's fame to sell this pavilion. So there's a whole series of photographs of Dalí and Gallo with these nude models, almost in the act of developing the costumes. And I think these are, I could have brought in any number of these. I brought in this one. It's a terrible scan, my apologies, but it's from a book. It's like that big. I couldn't find a better example of it anywhere. But I brought this one in particular because I think it's interesting to think about, we often at this point want to see Dalí as basically a businessman and a showman, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. He is still an artist. And I really like this as well because this is a photograph from this session that Dalí has worked over directly with ink. All the black here that you see, he hand painted on. And what I like about this is it's him thinking about what he really wants the costumes to look like, but also note that ink reflects that kind of rubber that he knows they're going to be using. So he's thinking very practically about this. And in his autobiography, the thing that keeps upsetting him is he wants the costumes to be like this, and they keep bringing him these long one-piece kind of cheesy mermaid tails. He's like, no, that's not what I want. Like I want this, you know? And it's this kind of disconnect between his vision and what he wants and what they're actually supplying him with and kind of demanding he use. Again, by most accounts, Dalí himself just eventually just wrote off the whole pavilion. He wrote a document that was kind of a statement against it and against the fact that they were taking away his artistic freedom. And even by his own claims, he just left to go back to Europe kind of entirely, didn't, not even seeing the completion of the pavilion. One thing I really like about Kacher's writing on it, though, is that he shows how there was a lot of thought and intentionality put into it by Dalí up front. Like, this wasn't just a money-making scheme for him. It's in this really interesting period where Dalí is becoming increasingly famous and well-known, but he is still an artist, and he's pushing that kind of approach. Now, of course, what Dalí himself and what the people involved in this corporation had hoped was that this would be a smashing success. By most accounts, it was not. It was a terrible, terrible endeavor, and I don't know if that was because of Dalí's kind of ultimate lack of follow through with it. He was not around to inaugurate it. It never did well. And in fact, you can find photos of the pavilion later, towards the end of the fair, where they even take the name Dream of Venus off it and just rename it something else because it's not doing well. And I think it's kind of a sad way to think about kind of Dalí's early American experiments here. I mean, the Dream of Venus could have been something really remarkable, and I think it's interesting that Levy's original idea was to basically do that more orthodox surrealist house based on the 1938 exhibition. But what I think is interesting is the way that Dalí, in how he envisions the Dream of Venus Pavilion, is as a holistic experience. It's performative, it is visual, it is sculptural, and I think it is him taking what had been done in the 38 exhibition and trying to bring it to an American audience. And I think it's rather interesting that it just doesn't succeed very well. Many historians have pointed out that by this point in the United States, Surrealism is seen as almost entirely a visual art movement. That is certainly being reinforced by the MoMA exhibition and the way the bar is kind of wrapping it into art history. And this is what's frustrating André Breton, is that, as we know, as we talked about way back in the first lecture, Surrealism is not just an art movement. It is a philosophy, it is an ideology, it is a lived experience. And so I find it fascinating that this is what Dalí is trying to do with the Dream of Venus. It's what Breton did and Éluard did with the International Exposition in Paris. It is very much about these kind of experiential approach to surrealism. So here we are around 1940. Dalí is now officially expunged from the Surrealist movement. He has, he's begun working on his autobiography, The Secret Life, which will, if you read it, is a huge diatribe against the Surrealists, as we talked about in the first and second lecture. Breton, late in 1939, in an issue of a journal, formally makes public how the split between the Surrealists and Dalí. So he's out at this point. He's a kind of his own person, as it were, even though he presents himself as the surrealist par excellence. And I think it just has an interesting coda to this lecture today, I think to the entire series, is this. I turn back to this photograph of Sigmund Freud's study. Again, I don't know the exact date, but there's an interesting account in Mark Palazzati's book on Breton, where on July 19th, 1938, so we're right in the midst, we're coming up on the Paris exhibition. There's an attempt to kind of reconcile Dalí and the movement at this date. So July 19th, 1938. At this point, Breton is in Mexico, meeting Trotsky, meeting Rivera, meeting Kahlo. In London, Salvador Dalí finally fulfills a life dream. He meets Sigmund Freud. Dalí was pleased to find that Freud knew of his paintings. And in this kind of, you have to kind of imagine Dalí, who, I mean, it's hard to do, but nervous, like he's trying to impress Freud. And trying to engage Freud, Dalí brings up his theories about paranoia, which, remember, had impressed one of Freud's students, Jacques Lacan. Freud is just still kind of befuddled. And he turns, after Dalí's been speaking kind of fervently about his theories for just, minutes upon minutes upon minutes. Freud turns to the person who had brought them together, the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, and he exclaims, quote, "I have never seen a more complete example of a Spaniard. What a fanatic." Now, the following day, Freud wrote Zweig a letter, and he notes in it this passage here, quote, "I was inclined to look upon surrealists who have apparently chosen me for their patron saint as absolute, let us say 95% like alcohol, cranks. The young Spaniard, however, with his candid, fanatical eyes and his undeniable technical mastery, has made me reconsider my opinion." End quote. Dalí passed this news along to André Breton, who was furious that despite his many years of efforts, meeting and writing to Freud, attempting to explain how Freud's theories influenced Surrealism and how Surrealism could be an active offshoot of Freud's theories, never worked. And it took Dalí finally to make Freud begin to see what Surrealism was. And I just want to end it here because I think that is the best way to show that, yes, Dalí had conquered Surrealism. Thank you very much.